do, and a kind of near breakdown in a sense. And out of it came some aggressive behavior.
In the 1,990 seconds, Hollywood didn't just crown stars, it consumed them. And for a brief, blazing moment, Madeleine Stowe stood at the very center of that fire. She wasn't a tabloid creation or a studio illusion. She was serious, intelligent, and dangerously compelling on screen. From epic romances to psychological thrillers, her performances carried weight, restraint, and a quiet intensity that audiences trusted. Then, just as her power peaked, she vanished. No scandal, no breakdown, no comeback tour. One of the most sought-after actresses of the decade simply chose to walk away. Hollywood never forgave that kind of decision and never truly explained it either. Was she pushed out, disillusioned, or did she see something the rest of the industry refused to admit? Because behind the beauty, the acclaim, and the box office success, a deeper conflict was building, one that would ultimately change everything. Madeleine Stowe did not arrive in Hollywood chasing fame the way so many others did. Her early years were defined by discipline, not ambition. Trained as a concert pianist from childhood, she understood structure, sacrifice, and long hours long before cameras ever found her. When tragedy ended her music path, acting emerged not as a desperate pivot, but as a quiet redirection. By the early 1,980 seconds, Madeleine Stowe was appearing in television roles that hinted at something deeper, an actress who could convey emotion without exaggeration. Hollywood noticed her beauty first, as it always does, but casting directors quickly realized that her appeal wasn't decorative. She had gravity. Films like Stakeout didn't just launch her career, they redefined how studios saw her. She wasn't merely the love interest. She anchored scenes, matched seasoned male co-stars beat for beat, and made audiences lean forward rather than relax. This was the beginning of her quiet power, a star who didn't beg for attention, but commanded it. Yet even as her rise accelerated, Stowe remained observant, already sensing the cost that Hollywood success often demanded, especially from women. As the late 1,980 seconds turned into the early 1,990 seconds, Madeleine Stowe found herself in rare territory. She wasn't boxed into romantic fluff, nor reduced to decorative roles. Instead, she moved deliberately into darker, more complex films, thrillers, neo-noirs, and psychological dramas that demanded emotional risk. Movies like Revenge and The Two Jakes placed her in morally ambiguous worlds where desire, power, and danger collided. Stowe didn't soften these stories. She sharpened them. But Hollywood has a pattern. When a woman proves she can handle complexity, the industry often responds by testing how much discomfort she's willing to endure. Stowe noticed it quickly. Her characters were increasingly placed in danger, humiliation, or violation not for narrative depth, but for spectacle. While audiences praised her performances, scripts began repeating a troubling theme: women as emotional battlegrounds rather than fully realized humans. Stowe played along longer than many realized, not out of weakness, but professionalism. Yet beneath that professionalism, dissatisfaction was growing. The success was real. The respect, however, felt conditional, and that realization would soon become impossible to ignore. By the time Unlawful Entry reached theaters, Madeleine Stowe was no longer just delivering performances, she was absorbing the psychological burden of an industry increasingly obsessed with fear, control, and female vulnerability. The film's commercial success confirmed that audiences were drawn to stories of betrayal and violated trust. But for Stowe, it also revealed a pattern she could no longer ignore. Again and again, her characters were placed under surveillance, threatened, or stripped of safety, as if danger itself had become her narrative identity. What could have slipped easily into exploitation was instead elevated by her intelligence and restraint, yet that elevation came at a cost. The irony was unmistakable and deeply unsettling. The more nuance and credibility she brought to these roles, the more Hollywood doubled down on the same formula. Stowe later reflected that what once felt abstract or meaningless began to feel uncomfortably personal, not because she lacked choice, but because she saw how quickly women were rendered interchangeable. The industry never demanded obedience outright. It rewarded compliance subtly and consistently. This was the moment she began to separate success from fulfillment. The unspoken contract was suddenly visible. Remain grateful, remain silent, remain endlessly available. And for the first time, she seriously questioned whether staying visible required the gradual surrender of something far more essential. When the last of the Mohicans arrived, it seemed like the ultimate reward: epic scale, romantic depth, critical acclaim. As Cora Munro, Madeleine Stowe delivered a performance that balanced strength and vulnerability without surrendering either. The chemistry was undeniable. The film became iconic. For many actresses, this would have been the moment to lock into prestige stardom permanently. But Stowe saw the illusion hiding beneath the triumph. Even in a role praised for its depth, she noticed how rare such opportunities truly were. One exceptional part didn't signal a systemic change. It was an exception, not a rule. After the accolades faded, the familiar scripts returned. Women written as symbols, not contradictions. Love interests without inner lives. Victims without agency. Stowe articulated a truth few stars dared to say aloud. Women were rarely allowed to be inconsistent. And inconsistency messy, human contradiction was exactly what made characters worth playing. The illusion cracked. The question was no longer whether she could succeed, but whether she should continue trying under those terms. 12 Monkeys cemented Madeleine Stowe's place in cinematic history, but it also marked an emotional breaking point. Her performance as Doctor, Catherine Rayleigh, required skepticism, empathy, terror, and resilience, sometimes all within the same scene. She wasn't overshadowed by spectacle or star power. She anchored the film's emotional reality. By every industry metric, she had won. Yet victory felt strangely hollow. Stowe had proven everything Hollywood demanded, and still the offers circling her desk reflected the same limitations. She began speaking openly about dissatisfaction, not with acting itself, but with the roles available to women. Playing victims, she said, had become unbearable. This wasn't rebellion, it was exhaustion. Fame had not failed her, the system had. And unlike many who cling to relevance at all costs, Stowe possessed something rare. The willingness to step back before resentment consumed her. That decision would redefine her legacy more than any award ever could. While Hollywood obsessed over youth, exposure, and relentless self-promotion, Madeleine Stowe chose something the industry quietly despises: stability. In a town where relationships are often treated as temporary arrangements, her marriage endured, not as a public performance, but as a protected private bond. She and her husband made a deliberate decision to trade Los Angeles for Texas, choosing land, labor, and distance over premieres and parties. This was not an escape, it was a declaration. When motherhood entered her life, it didn't merely adjust her priorities. It permanently reordered them. Stepping away from constant visibility was never framed as sacrifice in Stowe's mind. It was clarity. She returned to acting occasionally, selectively, and without the desperation that defines so many late-stage Hollywood comebacks. Ensemble films, carefully chosen roles. Later, television work that fit her life instead of consuming it. The shift was unmistakable. For the first time, she wasn't bending herself to fit the industry's expectations. The industry had to accommodate her terms. In a system that punishes women for aging, disappearing, or refusing spectacle, Stowe quietly rewrote the rules. She demonstrated that absence could be intentional, strategic, and deeply empowering, and that fulfillment does not require constant applause. Madeleine Stowe's story endures precisely because it refuses to follow Hollywood mythology. She didn't implode. She didn't fade because the phone stopped ringing. She walked away with full awareness of what she was leaving behind: money, visibility, status, and that is what makes her choice so unsettling to the industry. Hollywood is built on hunger, insecurity, and the fear of being forgotten. Stowe rejected all three. For audiences over 50, her journey resonates on a different frequency. It reflects a hard-earned truth that only time reveals. Success without meaning eventually becomes a burden. Stowe recognized the invisible ceiling closing in, the roles becoming smaller rather than richer, the expectations narrowing instead of expanding. And instead of clinging to momentum, she chose dignity. Hollywood thrives on noise press cycles, reinventions, constant relevance. Her silence spoke louder than any headline. In a town where ambition often devours identity, Madeleine Stowe preserved hers. She didn't need a dramatic farewell or a triumphant return to prove her worth. Her final, most powerful performance wasn't delivered under studio lights or captured on film. It was lived deliberately, privately, and far from the spotlight. And that may be the most radical act of all. Madeleine Stowe's story lingers because it quietly dismantles everything Hollywood teaches its stars to believe. She did not flame out in scandal. She did not age out of relevance. She did not wait to be discarded. Instead, she made a decision that the industry finds deeply unsettling. She chose herself. At the height of her power, when fame was still rewarding and the spotlight still warm, Madeleine Stowe recognized the limits being placed around her talent, her identity, and her future, and refused to mistake momentum for meaning. For viewers who grew up watching her in the 1,990 seconds, her journey hits differently now. With time comes perspective. You begin to see how rare it is for someone to walk away, not because they must, but because they can. Hollywood is built on scarcity thinking. Fear of being forgotten, fear of losing relevance, fear of stepping out of line. Stowe rejected that fear. She understood that constant visibility can quietly erode dignity, that success without fulfillment becomes another form of confinement. And rather than allowing resentment to calcify, she stepped aside with clarity and intention. Her absence was never an accident. It was a boundary. She chose family over frenzy, depth over noise, and a life lived fully over one endlessly performed. In an industry that punishes women for aging, disappearing, or refusing spectacle, Stowe proved that disappearance can be an act of power. She demonstrated that fulfillment does not require applause, and that identity does not need to be negotiated with an audience. Perhaps that is why her legacy feels stronger now than it did when she was everywhere. In a culture obsessed with reinvention, her consistency stands out. In a town addicted to ambition, her restraint feels radical. She didn't need a dramatic farewell or a triumphant comeback to validate her worth. Her most impressive performance was the one no camera captured, a life lived deliberately on her own terms, far from the spotlight. And that raises an uncomfortable question for Hollywood and for all of us. How many people stay in systems that no longer serve them simply because leaving feels unthinkable? How many confuse recognition with fulfillment? Madeleine Stowe didn't just walk away from Hollywood. She walked toward a life she could stand behind. And that choice, more than any role she ever played, is what continues to resonate. If this story changed how you see Madeleine Stowe or made you rethink how Hollywood treats its stars, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective, especially if you remember watching her films when they first hit theaters. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who appreciates classic Hollywood and the truths behind it. Your support helps keep these deeper conversations alive. And if you want more untold stories like this one, stay tuned because the next chapter might surprise you even more.